Well, good morning to everybody in New Zealand. We're just getting started here. I know everybody's able to come in slowly but surely, and I'm seeing the attendee list coming alive. So wonderful to see all of you here. I think there's 17 of you registered, so this is great. We're going to just let you all get settled in the next couple of seconds, and then we'll get started in just 2 minutes or so, and we'll get on the way with the webinar. Okay, it looks like the list is settled. So we're going to get started. Well, hello to all of our friends in New Zealand and our colleagues that work there. Welcome to our webinar. Very, very pleased that you decided to join us today. We've been exceptionally happy to partner with NZATAP and Rod and Amy, who have so graciously asked us to present this webinar to you this evening, this morning. It's nighttime here in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm from, and our presenters are in Vancouver, British Columbia, so they're 3 hours behind us. So we're really excited that across the time zones, we've been able to connect and hopefully sharing some really great information with you wherever you happen to be calling from. So thanks for joining us. For those of you who I've not met, my name is Grant Walters. I am the Director of Educational Programs at ACUHOI, which is the Association of College and University Housing Officers International. We've been so pleased to partner with our sister organization in New Zealand, and we've had several conversations with Amy and Rod, and so that's led us to some of these professional development opportunities that we're really excited to offer. And so this is the first one. And I'm really especially excited to present this today because Simon Fraser University, where our two presenters are from, is my alma mater. So I'm originally Canadian and by birth and by citizenship, and still am, and I now work in the United States. So it's really nice to have a piece of home and to have these two great professionals present to you today. So this is our webinar platform. We use Zoom. Some of you may not have used it before. Some of you may have for webinars. We're still figuring out a little bit about it. But what I want you to do first is you should have in your console the ability to raise your hand. So if you can hear me, I would love for you to be able to raise your hand. I see hands coming up. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you so much. I'm glad. It looks like most of you or all of you should be able to hear me. So I'm going to lower all of your hands. So throughout the webinar, I'm going to turn the screen over to Tracy Mason-Ennis and Zoe Woods in just a couple of seconds, who are our presenters for today. And they are going to share their screen and be able to control the presentation. I'm going to be the moderator, which means that I'll be able to field any questions. The easiest way to be able to answer a question is you should have a Q&A little button that you can press. And if you open it, you should be able to submit any questions you have. If you have a tech issue or something's not working well, feel free to send that message to me and I will be able to help you with that. If you have a question for the presenters, we're going to leave time at the end of the presentation to be able to answer any questions you might have. So you're welcome to type in questions into that box at any time. If it's something where we might need to stop the presentation and ask something in the moment, we're happy to do that, but we'll ask if we possibly can to save the questions for the end, just because we'll give you time to do that. We can also allow you to ask questions live if you'd like to do that. So you can also raise your hand icon and I can unmute you, but a lot of people choose just to type in a question and then I can ask that on your behalf and have the presenter. So either way, you will get your questions answered closer to the end of the webinar. And so without further ado, again, Tracy Mason-Ennis and Zoe Woods from Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, which is a suburb of Vancouver. And again, my name is Grant and I'm your moderator for this evening. And so I'm going to turn over the presentation to Tracy, who is going to share her screen. So just give us a second to be able to do that. And I'm going to make her the host. Okay, and Tracy, you should be able to share your screen now with whatever screen your PowerPoint is on. So you should be able to do that from your end here.
Okay. Are you seeing anything at all?
I'm not.
Okay. So do I actually press the button that says share?
Yes, yep, yep.
Okay.
As I said, folks, this is new for us here, so we're still figuring. There we go.
Okay.
And then just make it full screen, then start start your PowerPoint, and then it is all yours. And so, without further ado, folks, please welcome our presenters, and I'm going to have them talk a little bit about what they do at Simon Fraser and their roles there. And so, Tracy and Zoe, take it away.
Thank you so much, Grant. And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. It is truly a pleasure. This is Tracy Mason Innes talking. Truly a pleasure to talk to folks across the globe and share some of our experience thus far with the topic, but even to just have connections.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zoe Woods. I'm excited to be here today as well. As Grant introduced, both Tracy and I have experience working within residence and housing, as well as the institution at large, and are quite excited to be connecting with you today about this topic and talking to you a little bit more about Canada's journey and how we can hopefully help inform some of what you're taking forward from your institutions here today. So thanks for having us. We're honored to be here with you today.
So just to give a little bit of feedback, our first slide is actually what we used when we were at a Kauai this summer presenting on this. So our title is "Oh Canada, what have you done?" But also, what cannabis legalization has meant to housing programs across Canada. So we are sharing our story. There is a Canadian slant to this, and I think it's important that we provide some of the geopolitical, socio context in order to understand how the legalization has impacted us differently across this great nation. So depending on which country that you're located in, so New Zealand or US, it can certainly mean different things. So we want to share our story, but also remember that this is a Canadian story. So a little bit about what we do. The funny story about Zoe and I is that we're actually both in acting positions right now. I'm in an interim executive director student affairs position. My portfolio includes residence and housing, as well as the Interfaith Center, Indigenous Student Center, Health and Counseling Services, the Center for Accessible Learning, and Student Conduct. I think I got them all.
My portfolio as the Acting Director of Residence and Housing includes all the units under residence and housing. So for us, it includes a facilities unit, a residence life unit, facilities unit, communications, as well as front desk operations, and then an occupancy and hotel or guest accommodations team as well. We service approximately 1,600 students within SFU, with a campus both in our downtown Vancouver campus, which is in the heart of the city with 68 graduate beds there, and then 1,500 students on our Burnaby campus, which is located in Burnaby and a little bit more isolated on top of Burnaby Mountain. So those are some important contexts for us in our story.
So before we begin, we want to respectfully acknowledge that Simon Fraser University is on the unceded Coast Salish territory. These are the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Katzie nations. So this is an aerial photo of our main campus on Burnaby Mountain. We're surrounded by the beautiful lands of the unceded territories of our traditional people. And we do, as Zoe mentioned, we have two very rural campuses right in the heart of two different cities as well. So we are dealing with very different contexts when we talk about the legalization of cannabis. So this is a little bit of the geography lesson, and bear with us because I think it's really important to understand how legislation works differently across the globe. Canada is a very, very large country. We have territories and provinces. We are, a tremendous amount of land and very small population. We we are set up so that the legislation was a federal or a national legislation, which means that all the provinces and territories had to respond and create their own legislation. So unlike the US, where the legislation has been state by state, this was a national legislation, the entire country. Therefore, all provinces, territories, and municipalities had to respond with their own legislation. And I gotta tell you, as diverse as this country is, so is the legislation. And so that's what's really important to understand. Our Cannabis Act came into force October 17th, 2018. So our provinces and territories are responsible for determining how cannabis is distributed and sold within their jurisdictions. We knew about, well, since the federal election, I would say 2015, when Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister, was voted in, that he was going to make this happen. So we knew for a few years that this was coming, and had some time to prepare. Although I'd have to say that it was only after the legislation that we learned most of our lessons. Higher education in Canada. So it is a constitutional responsibility that higher education rests on the provinces of Canada. And so this means that there's a distinct system of education, including higher education, for each province. You'll see something very different in Quebec than what you will see in British Columbia. And our federal government is responsible for education of First Nations and our Royal Military College of Canada. So legislation for those institutions and for those folks in their education would come from the national or the federal government. So what does this mean for us on campus and in residence halls? So if provinces and territories are responsible for determining how cannabis is distributed and sold within their jurisdictions, they get to tell us how it can be sold, where the stores may be located, and how the stores may operate. So every province got to decide that on their own and uniquely. They also had the flexibility to add restrictions. So some provinces lowered the possession limits that the federal government legislated. Some chose to increase the minimum wage of use, and some restricted cannabis and where it could be used, including personal cultivation, so growing your own. Each province and territory has its own excise stamp for legal cannabis, which means that if you purchase cannabis, there's a stamp that you want to look for so that you know it's actually a legal product. Bit by bit, as we go across the country, just to give you a sense of how it's different region to region. In the Atlantic provinces, which include Newfoundland and Labrador, we have 16 universities, 18 campuses, over 71,000 full-time students, and 14,000 international students from 160 different countries. So you see these excise stamps that I was talking about. For each province, there's a different one. And so they're able to regulate, each of these provinces regulates something different. Quebec and Ontario, we have, well, close to 40 universities and even more, almost 70 colleges. Most of the population, I would say, in Canada is located in those regions. And they each took different stances in regards to legal age. So Quebec, the legal age for drinking alcohol is 18. So they chose the legal age for cannabis use to be 18. And then in Ontario, it's 19. So they also took different approaches to smoking on campus. And then the limits that the legislation told us was the limits of 30 grams in possession. So each province decided what it was that they were going to enact from legal age to possession. And then there's even more. In the prairie provinces, what you'll see are larger universities and more rural type areas, more space in between. But the University of Alberta has over 10,000 beds in residence. So some of the differences, again, Alberta, the age is 18, Manitoba's 19. And then there's different cultivations. In Manitoba, the residents, the institutions there have decided that students cannot grow or home cultivate is what we like to say. And you'll notice that we don't use the word marijuana. We use the word cannabis. So there is some terminology change that happened for us just around, because it's now legislation and it's best to use the legal terms. So some schools decided that they would stop the ability to grow their own personal plants. According to legislation, we're allowed 4 plants in our homes, in our private homes, for personal use. In British Columbia, where we are located, we have 16 universities, 11 public colleges, and many of these offer campus housing, and our legal age is 19. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues that we encountered, but as you can see, we have our own excise stamp, as does each province and territory. In the north, not very many, there's no universities, very few colleges. They've stayed pretty close to the legislation federally. And many of these communities are alcohol free, so many of the communities have chose to be cannabis free as well. So when we were thinking about this presentation, we tried to imagine what were some of the questions that you might have. So the geopolitical lesson is over. And now we can tell you a little bit about what we learned from having the legislation in place, waiting for our province to create its legislation, waiting for our municipality to create its legislation, and then waiting for our institution to create its legislation or its policies. So in the end, it really all depended how Simon Fraser University was going to treat cannabis use on campus. So you can imagine that there was a long wait, so we pretty much had to hurry up and get our community standards in place last minute, because we were waiting for folks to get things together. I don't know if you want to.
Sure. So some of the considerations, sorry, just making a slight shift here. Some of the considerations for some of the institutions that we've worked with, and some of the ones that we were looking at, were whether or not the cannabis policy was incorporated into current policies at the institutions themselves, or if they were creating standalone cannabis policies that then aligned with other policies on campus. So for example, do you add that into your smoking policies on campus, or do you create a separate one that's standalone? Again, as Tracy talked a little bit about, looking at whether or not it was banned outright on campuses, or whether or not it was going to be allowed on campus, and then how to facilitate that process, and how to then connect those procedures into policies was something else that was discussed. One of the factors that was influential there for many campuses was how connected their campus was to a city, and how easily or not the current procedures and policies in place could be adapted. So for example, if your campus is in the heart of an urban city and your policy is 10 meters away, if students or staff or community members could cross the street and be off campus, it would have been much easier for that institution to incorporate cannabis into that policy. However, if you were looking at allowing cannabis on a campus and it was not in a urban setting, but was in a rural one, and you're unable to cross 10 meters and be off campus, does that work, or do you need to look at designated smoking areas on campuses, etc.? So a lot of institutions were pulling on from research from both the states and each other. We really relied on our campus housing networks and institutions to be sharing information back and forth, and formed some working groups that were looking at cannabis and how we did that on our campuses and within our regions, and again, considered use on campus. As I talked a little bit about, there's some universities went to designated smoking areas, and collecting feedback from students along the way with this process. What some universities also heard was that cannabis smokers did not want to be at designated smoking areas with tobacco users. And so there are some institutions such as ours that have also gone with designated cannabis smoking areas, as well as separate designated tobacco smoking areas. So part of that, I think, is a choice that your institution makes with, I would encourage feedback from your students about what they want to say or see happen, and how that ties into what you're doing. Some other considerations from the residence community perspective that we found were ensuring that the policies the institution is implementing align with incorporated community standards or community living expectations within your residence halls. So whether that's within your contract or your contract referring to your policies and procedures elsewhere, making sure that the language I would suggest is incorporated and matches, and that the institution's aware of what those designated areas are recommended for residents and beyond. Another thing to consider in residence is possession and storage. So at Simon Fraser University, we decided as a campus that it was going to be allowed on our campus. And then in terms of what you can carry on you and on your person, incorporating that into residence as well. So 30 grams is what our students can carry with them on campus and can have in residence, which also led us to consider storage. We want to make sure that for those who are not choosing to engage in cannabis use and may be impacted negatively by the scent or by other factors, do not have their living disrupted by that. So one of the components that we looked at was vacuum sealed storage for students if they are storing it in residence. Our standards are quite clear that they cannot use cannabis in the community, that they have to take the cannabis to a designated smoking area. So ensuring that your guidelines are clear and in line again with university policy is something that we think would be important. In terms of home cultivation, SFU made a decision, as I think a majority of institutions did in British Columbia and beyond, to not allow growth of, or cultivation, sorry, home cultivation in residence halls. There was concerns around the amount of energy it would take to properly grow them, and again, scent, as well as impact to community with both of those components. Something else that we thought about but didn't anticipate as much as we should have was mail and the delivery of cannabis to our residence halls. So with the legalization process, marijuana, I'm still working on the language, sorry for that. The cannabis can be delivered to our residence halls legally through mail delivery. And with the legal age of cannabis being 19 and a majority of our residents being under that age, we needed to quickly implement some processes so that we could be checking ID of students who were receiving marijuana in the mail, and making sure that we had a process that we could implement that matched both our community standards, our policies on campus, as well as making sure that we were following the law with pickup and mail delivery. Space use in residence and on campus, again, identifying where students can use cannabis and how to build that into your education planning so they know where those areas are. And I think too, in terms of, roommate agreements, and that for me ties into education with our students and your curriculum building, is how do you teach students to, when you have difference and diversity in our residence halls, you may have a roommate who does wish to use and one who doesn't, one who stores and one who doesn't. So considering those factors is important.
We mentioned storage again because it was just so important.
In terms of student considerations, some of the other factors that I think were important for us and that we continue to explore and look at how we can improve communication and education are with our international students. Many of our international students and residents, and we have a high percentage of international students in our residence population, there are international laws that restrict what students can and cannot do with, or can and cannot use cannabis in their, both when they're traveling abroad and in their own home country. And so we're working hard with our international services for students to ensure that that information is available and present for them, both in orientation programming, in their travel abroad program guides, and also doing our best to include that education in our own orientation programs so they understand if they choose to use if they choose to use cannabis in Canada, what does that mean for possible impacts if they're traveling back home or traveling abroad? Anything to add to that? No? Okay. Our varsity athletes are another group of students that we needed to carefully consider and work with our athletics team to do some education with. Our athletes are NCAA athletes, and that ultimately requires an additional code of student conduct that they need to follow, and includes within that code of conduct expectations it's connected to the United States and travel there. And so depending on the state they're traveling to, the teams they're with, there could be restrictions that they have to not use cannabis, even if it is legal in Canada. And so working to educate those students on use there, not only personally, but if they are in and around it in residence, what do they do and how do they ensure that they can live comfortably in the community while not putting their varsity athletic position or designation at risk. We also saw many students experimenting for the first time who have not before. So much like, I think we've seen with alcohol in the past, you combine, a diverse residence community with people who have a lot of experience using alcohol with some who've never used before. And sometimes students help positively educate each other on those uses and take care of each other. And I think, with cannabis being in that area now, a part of our upcoming culture and education, people are experimenting, and we're working on catching up with what some of that education can look like and how we work to support students and get them the information and the facts so that as they're experimenting, if they're using, that they're doing so safely, and making sure that at the end of the day, if people are choosing to use cannabis, that they're having a positive experience that hopefully isn't impacting those around them.
So some of the education and resources that came out of this, and I'd have to say this is probably the piece that we haven't seen too much effort done in regards to institutions across Canada. When we presented at a QUEBEC this summer, very few campuses had specific education and resources dedicated to cannabis use. However, we are, sharing some links here. We'll make sure that you have copies of these slides of some potential resources you could use, but mostly the federal government and the British Columbia government. And each of the provinces, I'm sure, have information about cannabis. And as we learn from cannabis through research and the ability to understand it better, I'm sure more and more information will be coming out. So certainly, if you want to look, we have a little campaign called Love Your Brain. It talks about, paranoia and that there are risks with trying or having a cannabis and using it in certain levels. So just in some ways, the very positive aspect of having this legalized is that we can have open conversations about this and with students, and there'll be more research to come.
Our campaign was also very connected to UBCs as well. So I think it's important to give the University of British Columbia a little bit of credit as we're putting our campaign out there, is that we borrowed, with permission, quite a bit of insight from them when we were putting ours together.
Absolutely. So BC government, there's a Get Cannabis Clarity. It talks about what cannabis is, information on edibles, what's legal, what's not, health and travel. As we mentioned, travel is probably one of the biggest adjustments we've seen. We're very close to the US border, and we hear often that people don't seem to understand they can't bring cannabis over that border, and it's the topic of many news headlines about people who keep on trying. And then there's information about growing at home as well and what that entails. Cannabis plants are a very unique plant, vegetable, I don't know what it is. So it takes a certain amount of energy, lighting, and so it's important for folks to understand that. And also the legal ramifications. There are restrictions around children and the presence of children and locations of even sales. And the enforcement, certainly being legalized, it is people are a little bit more, well, there's less consequences. Not that there was a whole lot before, though. I think a lot of people would classify this as sort of a, we didn't really, it wasn't that big of a change for British Columbia to have cannabis become legalized. And we've, a year later, still struggle with access to the legal product. So that's a whole other issue that we've been dealing in residence, in that mail has been one of the only ways that the students can receive cannabis, because we still struggle with municipalities and provinces allowing the sale of the retail buildings and abilities. So we're on to our next phase of legalization of cannabis. And so this year, Canada is actually allowing edibles to be legal. So the legislation a year ago did not include edibles. And so we are now learning more about this legislation. We give you a little bit of information about what we know, the different types of edibles. And this is probably the area where we all agreed this summer when we spoke that has the most concern, in the sense that we think that students are more likely going to try edibles than they would try smoking cannabis. Mm-hmm. And we've also already seen the impact of students not understanding the consequences of ingesting too much cannabis. We've seen medical consequences to that. And so as we prepare, it's about preparing students for making sure they make the right decisions and understanding how cannabis will interact with their bodies differently in an edible form. A lot about our society has changed. Impaired driving, it's no longer drinking and driving, it's impaired driving, and the police force are getting wiser about how to detect intoxication. We're very careful about where we're putting our retail stores for cannabis. There's legislation about how far they need to be from school zones. Public use, where it is that people can use, smoke, ingest cannabis is still being worked out. Certainly growing plants at home for personal use has been a change. And then of course, cannabis in the workplace was a very big conversation. The conversation for residents and housing was, what about our live-in staff? The folks that we hire, the university employees who live in residence, if as individuals in their private home, they're permitted so many things, how can we enforce, or shall we, or should we enforce the same rules on them? I mean, I would argue that some of the community rules already apply, but there's certain balances of their freedom of choice as well. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is still an ongoing conversation. This is a whole lot of information of us talking to a computer screen. And I think we just skimmed the topics because we really wanted to hear what questions they had, and see if we can help provide some guidance. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you both so much, Zoe and Tracy. I really appreciate that. So again, we would love to hear some questions from the audience. So again, we can do one of two things. On your screen, you have the ability to raise your hand and ask a question, and I am happy to broadcast you real time. And you can ask your question over your audio. If you'd rather type it in, you can type it in the question and answer box or the Q&A box, and we can submit it that way, and I can read your question and have Zoe and Tracy answer them for you. Oh, there is a question from one of the attendees here. Has cannabis encouraged the use of other drugs on campus?
That's something I don't know if we know. It's a good question. I think there was drug use before, and whether or not it's changed in quantity or frequency, I'm not sure. I don't think we know that. But it's a good research question. Many people think it's a gateway to other drugs. My anecdotal experience is that it tends to be a pretty chosen drug. and often the only thing that we've seen them use it with mostly is alcohol. Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Roger. What are the challenges that come with managing live-in staff that choose to use cannabis?
That's a great question. We have not experienced difficulty with that yet. I think some of the considerations are that we've looked at and that we've spoken with our staff around are instead of looking at the cannabis itself, we had the conversation around judgment and sobriety while working. And I think some of the challenges that we anticipated were the same kind of living, expectations for live-on staff that we had for students. And when we spoke with our live-in staff, there was no concerns about the expectations around storage. We didn't have any staff who were interested in growing, and so weren't trying to find a way to see if they could separate that out from the community living expectations that we had in residence. So I think in that sense, we've been able to follow our standards, but I think some of the considerations are expectations for use. And we chose to look at it similarly to alcohol in terms of, you need to be able to make decisions and have good judgment. And for us, that means being sober while you are on call or in a capacity where you are working. If you are not spending time in a manner that does not impact the community negatively, is the expectation that we hold there. And then also making sure that we're in line with our university policies and procedures for staff working as well.
Yeah, there's legislation around work safety. And so that was certainly legislation that butted up against this, and not just for our live-in staff, but for those of us that work on campus, and students who are in trades. Or are operating heavy machinery, or are manipulating something that so the whole idea is that you can't be intoxicated, there can't be any sort of substance, you can't be impaired judgment, and so that legislation helps support that environment.
Another question from one of our attendees is, what new issues arose as a result of having cannabis in the halls? And so maybe just general things that, arose that maybe were unexpected or that were new for you all to contend with.
I think the thing that kind of made me laugh is it just felt like all of a sudden everyone wanted to light up. It seemed like as soon as the legislation came in play, it was okay to smoke indoors somehow. And so we had a lot of complaints of people just smoking cannabis in the residence halls. And we don't allow any smoking. We're very clear about that. But for some reason, there was this, assumption that somehow it was legal, therefore they can do whatever. So that kind of died down, I would say, after a little while. Yeah, very quickly while we were on it too. Yeah.
That's it. So I think that, as Tracy said, I think a part of it, was excitement that it was legalized, and so people were celebrating. Also, the time period in which it became legal would have aligned more for us with weather where it gets cold and very rainy and very wet quite quickly. And so I think that it encouraged use of indoor smoking more. And because it was legal, I think students were less like if they had any hesitation to follow the community standard because of the legality behind it, that release of the legal component gave them again permission to sort of, or they thought it gave permission to smoking inside. And so as Tracy said, we did some educational work right away to work with our student staff and get some education campaigns out saying, it's legal, but you still need to smoke it outside. And the impact of smoking inside, no matter what it is the same. So whether it's cannabis or it's cigarettes or it's vaping, any use of something inside that could impact peers and safety equipment, we need you to take elsewhere. And these are the designated spaces you can take it. But that was something I think that we didn't expect to see an increase of. I think it's normalized again this year. We also now have some very clear indications in our, on our websites and our policies and through our education campaign about where students can use marijuana and smoke and cigarettes at the designated location, so it's more clear. Something that I didn't expect was to see students not want to smoke together, that one designated smoking area wasn't going to work, that people who were smoking tobacco and people who were smoking cannabis wanted separate stations. So that's something we've had to navigate on our campus, and are hoping to improve some designated smoking areas moving forward.
And I would have to say SFE is a little bit on the minority in the sense that most campuses chose to just say no smoking and ban it outright. And so, but the picture that I showed you at the beginning where you see where our campus is located, if students were told they couldn't smoke on campus somewhere, they would be in the forest. And we have other issues with that. And so the decision for the institution to create these designated spots was really made out of practicality of where we're located, whereas our other two campuses, they are banned because as soon as you walk outside, you're on city property. The other thing to think about too is that I think that I always thought if I smelt it, there must be 20 people smoking it. I think our numbers of use are actually quite low, and we saw some research done through a magazine called Maclean's. Not that I would say they're the best researchers in the world, but they compared to across Canada and other institutions. And Simon Fraser University, although in British Columbia, has a very low usage of cannabis into like the 10%. So it you know, in that case, that kind of helps with that social norming of everyone's doing it, and really that's not the case.
Perfect. Amy asked the question, has legalization opened up improved opportunities and willingness for testing drugs? And I'm not sure if that means if the government is testing them or if people are testing them, but I'm assuming that means that
there's more research for sure.
Yeah.
You'll see more research. SFU's taken on more research with cannabis, and the other universities and colleges and the federal government as well. So certainly we're going to learn more, which is great. And that will help us inform our decisions.
And Amy clarified, she was talking about testing and testing stations for people in the health centers and reducing harm of laced drugs and things like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we don't have anything like that. We had a big event at the beginning of the school year, and there was talk of bringing a non-for-profit organization to this event that would test students as they come in, just to get a sense of where they are in the levels, so that their own awareness of what they shouldn't, you know, like what their choices, to help form their choices for the alcohol that they were about to have access to. So there are these organizations that I think we're probably going to involve more with our large events to help us understand that. But that's a good question about our health and counseling services and using that as well. That's a good thing for us to think about.
Thanks, Amy, for clarifying that. We have two questions that are fairly similar about the impact of behavior and community standards in residents, either positive or negative, and have you two noticed anything there?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
They want to know if there's been an impact on student behavior. So have you seen, you know, positive things that have come out of the legalization, or have there been negative impacts of how students behave in the halls?
Right. Thank you for clarifying. I think, you know, in the first semester where it became legal and it was implemented, I think there was a little bit of negative impact in terms of, you know, that we saw an increased amount of people smoking inside and needed to do the education to clarify that that still wasn't okay. And we saw a lot of students talking about either, you know, being glad that it was designated smoking areas on campus where they could use it, and some being frustrated that, you know, even though the designated smoking areas are, you know, 10 to 12 meters away from their room, that the scent was blowing into the windows at certain times of the year. So I think there was a little bit of negative impact there that we saw at first. And we then stepped into work to mitigate that as much as we could. And so I think that that's been something that's been really positive for us, is that we've been able to talk more openly about education around cannabis. And so when we're looking at community standard follow-up, for example, we can move the conversation away from, you know, and we've always tried to sort of say, you know, regardless if it's legal or not, we want to talk about you and, you know, what services and resources and supports you may need if you're using it, how often you're using it. And you know, the community impact, to really just focus on those second two things. And so I think that's been a really positive shift for us. And with the, you know, education and resources that are out there, I think that's another plus that's really helped us both through the government and through our own institutions. And so I think ultimately it's been a positive shift overall to have it legalized and out there. I mean, you know, sort of like alcohol and a few other things, if students were going to do it, they were going to do it, right? And so I think, you know, it may have inhibited a few who were really law abiding and following and, you know, weren't going to do it because it was not legal. But at least for us in British Columbia and in the Lower Mainland in particular, so the Vancouver and Burnaby area, it was quite normalized. And so I think that it gave us again, permission to talk more about it, to create educational campaigns, connect students to resources and supports, and to have more open conversations with students that connect them to resources, supports, and education. So overall, I think it's been a positive shift to have that out there.
Our philosophy has been harm reduction, and not zero tolerance or banning. We've taken that philosophy over the years. It's switched. We used to be zero tolerance on a lot of things, but recognizing that we're an educational institution, this is an important developmental stage of most of our students' lives, and we'd be better served, and they'd be better served if we can have these open conversations and teach and educate, and so that the choices are well informed.
Thank you. Somebody had asked a question about, have you had issues around anxiety attacks or students who have consumed way too much and having to deal with some of the consequences of those things?
We had a few overdoses last year, maybe 2 come to mind, and this was edibles. So again, the legislation wasn't really there, but I mean, like this, it was all occurring before the legislation. We're just able to talk about it more. Mostly it was about not understanding how edibles work. We do see some mixing here and there, alcohol and cannabis tends to be a hand-in-hand kind of deal. Again, it's about the education, and certainly alcohol has been something that we've dealt with for many, many years, decades in residence and housing, and the learning that comes from the experience and the testing of one's limits and the testing of understanding is the same that they have to go through. It's just trying to do it in a safe manner and recognizing that certainly as edibles are introduced, we have to be very careful where we're getting them. Legal product is safer because it's regulated, and so really encouraging our students to stay legal. The downfall is that it tends to be more expensive, and so one of the things that we're finding a year later in Canada is that people are still using the underground market or the black market because of access has been really difficult, and price. And so we want to encourage our students to, if they're going to use through the legislative accesses.
And this is kind of an interesting follow-up here. Somebody asked about restrictions or policies regarding how cannabis gets processed. And so they said, understanding that producing edibles is part of the legalization, but what about processing cannabis to produce resins? And I'm not sure if either of you know about anything connected to that, but.
So producing anything where they would use, anything where a student would do to give to another person or to sell would be illegal. So everything that the legislation talks about is personal use, personal possession. So 4 plants per person, 30 grams per person, any kind of like sharing or you try this or distribution or anything like that would be considered illegal and would fall under our community standards.
So for example, the cases that Tracy was talking about with the overdoses, what we saw in one of those, and to be clear, both of those cases resulted in hospital visits for students who were ultimately okay. And then, as they returned to residence living and campus living, meeting with us for follow-up and education, etc. But one of those cases involved a student who had experienced edibles being with another one who didn't, who said, oh, try this. And they weren't really paying attention as they were gaming. The student tried a little bit and didn't feel anything, so tried some more and still didn't feel anything. And then, 2 cookies later, had some panic attacks and a lot of anxiety and ended up in the hospital because of some other complications that occurred there. So being able to have, teach about the responsibility of the edibles, those edibles, as Tracy indicated, weren't legally obtained. And so trying to provide the education around that is something that I think, the BC government or the federal government is working on putting more information out. And I think BC is as well, because each province then takes the legislation and rolls it out. And we know something that that one of the things that came out for us recently is that the sale became legal in mid-October. The actual sale of the product is going to begin in December. So we expect it to start coming, available for sale in that time period. And one of the components that I believe they're working on with that is instructions for use, right? So, try so much to start, and then if, you know, we don't feel anything this much time later, try again, or being aware of the amount of THC that's in a cookie or a gummy or whatever else it is that's being ingested.
Yeah, the edibles will come with a lot more instruction, almost like pill bottles, and how to do aspirins and recommended dosages, as does the cannabis, right? There's instructions as well, or when you're purchasing, there's more sort of, I guess, consultation about how to use. So that in itself is helpful and different than the black market. Yeah.
Perfect. That was great.
Something else I wanted to mention too that's important is the timing of the legislation and legalization is never ideal. I mean, you think about October and December. For us, that's the middle of our first semester. So it's the beginning of our first semester or the end of our first semester, which is a really difficult time to enact some of these things. So some schools actually decided to ignore the legislation, keep their policies in place until the end of the school year, and then start a new sort of community standards, a new way of being once those students had left. So, you know, that was their choice. It just made sense than trying to change something in the middle of the semester.
Excellent. Thank you for that response. I'm not seeing any more questions in the queue, but if anybody had any additional questions they'd like to ask, we're certainly happy to answer those. You can either type them in or again raise your hand and I can let you answer them live. So we'll take just a couple of seconds here and let anybody else who might want to ask anything put something through, and I'll watch for a second here. So the question came through, ultimately good thing or bad thing from the halls in your experience of the legislation. And I think you talked about the behavioral stuff, but anything that the legalization has caused that has been either positive or negative for you all that maybe you haven't had a chance to mention yet?
I think for me, it's a really good question, and it's nice to answer this a year later. I think looking at it 2 years ago, I would have been more of in a panic when I saw that the legislation was coming. I had, I don't know, visions of, you know, Animal House or whatever was happening. And I think a lot of people were really worried about this, that we'd have people walking around here like zombies. And it's just funny to think about that, because really, I think we've basically legalized what was already pretty normalized behavior. I think what I'm concerned about, and I remain concerned about, is just students making the right choices and being informed about what it is that they're ingesting. That's what I'm always concerned about. You know, just like alcohol, that also is one of the things that keeps me up at night. That hasn't changed, and these are just other ways of coping and experimenting. That, you know, I wish we could have more conversations about this and implement more sort of transition programs and orientation programs that address this.
Perfect. Amy had something she wanted to make sure she said to our presenters, and so I'm going to let her do that, and I'll unmute her. So I'll do that. Hold on one second here, Amy. Let me. I think I can do that. Hold on one second here. Amy, type it into the let me just see. I'm trying to figure out how I can do that. Amy, type a question again into the question box, and I should be able to get you to answer live from there. I'm sorry. Just select hello or something, and I can do that.
I wonder if I can do it, Grant. I'm just.
Oh, yeah, you might be able to do it. Oh, there she is. Yep. So if you just unmute her microphone, she can answer or talk to you. There you go. Amy, go ahead.
Alrighty. Hey, Zoe and Tracy, I just wanted to say a massive thank you on behalf of all of us. It has been super informative. And I think if nothing else, for people who haven't even started to kind of think about what the impacts might be, just starting to get those juices flowing and thinking about how are we, both in the halls, but also universities. Obviously, universities will often make those decisions, like you said, before we even get a word in, but we know that there'll be impacts regardless. And so yeah, really useful to start getting that thinking going. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of ongoing conversations around this for us here, and would love to continue kind of keeping in contact and touching base with when we do have things come up that we kind of want some expertise around. So yeah, just really appreciate the time that you've put into this, and obviously Grant for putting it all together for us.
Of course.
Thank you for allowing us to share. That's how we learn.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. I'm imagining that we'll get lots of great feedback following this. So thank you.
Wonderful. So Zoe and Tracy have shared their email addresses. So we're recording this webinar, and we'll make sure to send that over through the association, so that Amy and Rod can make that available to you all somehow. And we'll also put it in a place in the Akuhoi library, so we'll be able, we'll find a way to make sure you get a link to it, so that if you'd like to go back, or if you'd like to share it with your colleagues at your schools, at your colleges and universities, we would love for that to happen. And so the entire recording will be there available for your enjoyment and consumption. And so, but if you have questions, I'm assuming that, you know, Zoe and Tracy are happy to answer those for you via email. And again, we'll make sure we give you those email addresses when we share that as well, just so you have them on hand. And Akuhoi also will have some additional resources that are not necessarily just, you know, strictly Canadian. We're going legal mostly for medicinal use state by state, but there are some different places around the United States, some different states that are implementing legislation for legalized use. So we also have access to some different resources if you're ever looking for other examples, either from the United States or from other countries that are part of our membership. And so if you have things that could be helpful that we could help you out with, we can do our best to connect you, and you're welcome to contact any of us here in the central office. I'll make sure that I share my email address as well with Rod and Amy, and they can pass that along to you if we can be of any help. And so we thank you for joining us. We're doing a couple more webinars for you all next month, and we'll have registration open for those fairly shortly, and have confirmation of our speakers. And so we hope you found this informative. Thank you all for joining us. We know that it's a busy time of the year for everybody. And so thanks for all your wonderful questions. We always love that engagement. And again, thank you to Zoe and to Tracy for their great information. And thank you again. We'll look forward to seeing you shortly again in the next few weeks at the next webinar, and look forward to engaging with you one more time. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.